So I guess the kind of, since we're here at Austin Film Festival, this festival has a very sweet place in your heart, I believe.
It does, yeah.
I guess 2012-ish, 2013. Let's zoom back a couple of years and tell me what made you want to dive into Austin, to UT, to AFF. You know, what caused this? I mean, you could have gone USC, you could have gone a different couple of routes. Why Austin?
Well, in truth, I couldn't have gone to USC because they did not accept my application. I applied to 5 schools. UT was the only one that accepted me outright. And at the time, I didn't know any different. I mean, I did my research or whatever, but I had no idea what the outcome was going to be in any of those scenarios. I know that UT ended up giving me the opportunities that led to my career, so I couldn't be happier that that's how it turned out. But I applied to a couple schools in New York and a couple in LA and here. And the reason I applied here was just because of the sort of indie film scene and you know, to be honest, the reputation of the town itself was appealing to me as a place to you know, hang out for a couple of years while I was studying. And so it couldn't have worked out better because when I ended up here, I not only had a great education at UT Austin, but also, you know, was introduced to the festival, and through the festival met the man who is my current boss, Rob Thomas, who was living in Austin at the time with his family, and at that point was probably best known for Veronica Mars and Party Down. And I ended up meeting him through the festival and interning with him while I was a student. And at the tail end of that internship and the tail end of my time here, it sort of coincided with the Veronica Mars Kickstarter movie project getting off the ground. So my first job in LA was one that Rob gave me as a production assistant on the movie, and everything that happened since then sort of jumped off from that point.
Let's talk about that specific panel. If I'm not mistaken, Rob was leading the panel. It wasn't about Veronica Mars, it was about Party Down, right? It
was, and it wasn't even, like the first time I saw him speak was at the festival, like in October at one of the panels, and the reason I saw him speak was he was actually the moderator, and he was having a conversation with Hart Hansen, who he had given his first American television writing job, and Hart Hansen is from Canada, as am I, and that's why I went to that panel. But hearing Rob speak was pretty informative and entertaining as well, and I was a big Party Down fan, more so probably than Veronica Mars at the time, and he did an event, it was affiliated with the AFF or sponsored by the AFF, but it was in March of that year. It was at the Paramount Theater, and the way that they had sold Party Down, Rob and his producing partners, was instead of shopping a script, they actually just shot a pilot and shopped that pilot. When it got picked up by Stars, they reshot and they'd recast a few roles, but it was essentially the same script. And the thing that he was screening was the original pilot. And then there was a big Q&A afterward where he talked about how it was to be, you know, still maintaining his career in Hollywood while living with his family in Austin. And that's what kind of sparked the idea of trying to approach him for the internship.
I've got to ask, coming down from Canada, what was the biggest adjustment? The weather, the people, I mean, the food?
All of the above. The weather was a shock to my system because it was, you know, August when I came down here, and it was over 100 every day. I didn't even think in terms of Fahrenheit at that point, so that was an adjustment unto itself. But I would walk like 10 minutes to the bus stop every morning and have to bring a change of clothes for school because I'd be so sweaty. So that was a shock. But it, you know, as far as the vibe, it's not completely foreign to what I was familiar with. Austin obviously has its own kind of unique thing going, but I'd visited here before, and I was kind of aware of what I was getting into. And like I said earlier, that was part of the appeal. So it was all a bit of an adjustment. The biggest thing for me, I think, was just that I was in my early 30s at the time, and so it was kind of a later in life decision to go back to school than most of my classmates, for instance, had made. So recalibrating to being a student again and to, you know, being at the, you know, ground floor or whatever of a new career, or an attempt at a new career after having another career for quite some time that I was pretty comfortable in, was probably the biggest adjustment, more so than moving to Austin and getting used to being in America.
So I'm a Spurs fan, and I saw something that Rob said that I think was, I've got to ask. He said that one of the first things you kind of pushed onto him was that you were a Spurs fan.
Yeah.
And he never knew if that was real, if you were just trying to get in with the Texan or. Let's answer the question. Are you a diehard Spurs fan?
Well, it depends on how you define diehard, but I am definitely a huge Spurs fan now. That's my team. A lot of that had to do with living in Austin, and I was already there for about a year before I met Rob, so it was authentic. But I'm no fool if that is one of his interests. That certainly when we first met, something I was going to play up. I was a huge basketball fan as a kid. Spurs were not my team back then, and I think when I was in my 20s, I was a Suns fan because Steve Nash was our big deal Canadian basketball player, and the Robert Horry body check lives in my memory and made me not so much a Spurs fan. Really, in the heart of their dynasty. I came to them a little bit later, and it was really crystallized the two series with the Heat, because I could not stand the Heat. I did not want them to win a title ever. And that second year when the Spurs, got the revenge was about the sweetest basketball memory I think I have.
Yeah, we live in Dallas. I'm not a huge Mavericks fan, but when we beat the Spurs, it was or the Spurs when we beat the Heat, it was also. Thank God.
Yeah, that was a great series as well, though I'm not much of Mavericks are fine. I'm not for them or against them, but anyone who was beating the Heat in those years was going to be close to my heart. So
let's talk about the web series. And you said you weren't, huge on Veronica Mars, and yet, the character of Dick is such a dynamic character. What was it like writing for that? And I know it didn't start out as something massive and big like it ended up. But what was it like when it started to kind of blossom into something bigger? Yeah,
and I should mention that I certainly became a Veronica Mars fan once I started working with Rob. I had a couple other buddies that were interning with him as well, that were classmates of mine, and we all binged everything that he did over and over again just to kind of get the tone down and make sure that we, were kissing ass in the right way. So I definitely became a fan, and by the time the movie, the Kickstarter was happening and then the movie was in production, that was a huge thrill because I'd become so familiar with the show and fell in love with it. The Play It Again Dick project started as, I think the studio that produced the movie first brought it to Rob and his producing partners as a promotional idea. So originally it was going to be a very small thing that they were going to try to put out there on YouTube or whatever in the build up to the movie's release. And we thought of it as roughly the production value or the investment level of like a Wayne's World. Not the actual movie, but like the show within the show. We thought it was going to be sort of public access, Ryan in his basement with, different other actors from the show playing video games and shooting the shit or something like that. We thought it was going to be pretty low key. And then I think at some point, if I remember correctly, Rob asked what kind of budget level they were thinking, and it was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he realized it was a little bit bigger of a project that the studio had in mind, and he had a ton on his plate. Like that was, post-production on Veronica Mars, building up to the release of the movie, was happening at the same time as development for, as I recall, 3 different shows, one of which was iZombie, and so that was going into pilot production as well. And he just had too much going on to get that done before the movie's release. So we kind of pushed it till after the movie came out, and I think that's when the CW sort of got interested in hosting it on the CW Seed. So it sort of evolved into this different thing, and then once it did, we were looking at a British series. The name sort of escapes me, but Garth Marenghi is the name of the character in the title, and it's very similar. Like it's this sort of like goofy behind the scenes making of documentary of a very poorly made program, and so that was the template. And from there, Rob sort of provided the blueprint, and he and I kind of split the writing duties, although he did a lot more of the heavy lifting. And then another mentee of his, a kid that he used to teach in high school, directed it. His name's Viet Nguyen, and he's now directing a bunch of TV shows, including iZombie. So it was a real like in-house kind of family-run operation. And then Ryan is so game for everything, and everyone loves Ryan so much that all the other actors came on board. And it was just this like dirt cheap, by the seat of our pants sort of production, but that everybody was game for, and everybody was happy to just be around each other again, because they have such a sort of a family environment from the original show, and then on down to all the people that Rob has kind of brought along the way. So,
can you talk about the relationship with Rob? I mean, I think when people think coming on to working with someone like, I mean, even you mentioned in a couple of interviews, like you thought you'd probably be getting coffee and doing simple stuff, but right. Rob's process and the amount of work, like you said, is so massive that it's a very different environment. He pushes you to do things and does ask you to do some pretty massive things, and it's obviously impacted you. What's that whole dynamic like? It's got to be something unique.
I would assume so. It's the only experience of its kind that I've had, so I have nothing to compare it to. But I did think that when I approached him to become his intern or intern for his company or whatever the case might have been, because I really had no idea what to expect when I approached him, I thought it would be a lot of gophering type stuff, but it was essentially, he would write for several hours in the morning, and myself and the other guys that were interning for him would just come over and at first kind of be there for him to talk things out too, and that became talking things out with us, and then slowly, as I think trust was built, and he started to feel like we had decent heads on our shoulders, he would ask us to pitch ideas and that sort of thing. So it was kind of like a mini writer's room with just a couple of people, where for the most part, I think it just helped Rob in terms of his productivity to have somebody there to talk ideas out with. And then that slowly evolved to, pitching ideas and getting down to pitching details for scenes and getting that sort of involved in the various scripts he was writing. At that time, it was three different pilots, none of which got produced, but one was for HBO, one was for USA, and one was for the CW, I think. So he's working on all these things at the same time, which is an unbelievable juggling act to begin with, to my mind. But just having us there to sort of act as a sounding board, I think, was helpful for his productivity. And then on our side, it was, immensely impactful, because we were getting this sort of immersion in what the world of developing and producing television was actually like. We were in classes at the time where we were trying to learn how to, how to build stories, and that was certainly part of the education with Rob as well. But we would be privy to notes calls that he was getting from the network and studios. He was developing his projects, and we'd be privy to like the kind of genesis of a piece of intellectual property, being developed into something that could work for television and that sort of thing. So we were getting like much more of a nuts and bolts kind of immersion in what the world of TV was like, and getting an opportunity to just throw ideas out there that every once in a while stuck and became part of the script that he was doing. So it was, it was super informative, and also just kind of a thrill to be working with this guy whose work we were fans of. It was a little surreal at the beginning, but he was so welcoming and generous with his time and with his experience that pretty quickly it just started to feel like an education that that we felt pretty grateful to have the opportunity to partake of, because you just can't get that anywhere else.
So let's jump into iZombie, because I think that's become its own kind of beast unto itself. What was it like in the very beginning when the show kind of took off? And I specifically want to talk about location and that getting to go back up into the north and into a different environment. Right. What was that experience like? I mean, I know you guys still wrote a lot of the materials in Austin, but when you moved up, outside there, talk a bit about that.
Well, we started in LA. Like, Rob was in LA pretty full time when we were doing iZombie, and I was his assistant while he was developing it. So it was a pretty similar process to what I described for our internship back in Austin, except that this time Warner Brothers was paying me, and and not much, but and so I was working with him and his co-creator on iZombie, Diane Ruggiero Wright, and so it was a lot of the same thing. But they had more of a of a writer's room with each other, and in this case, I wasn't as involved as a sounding board because they had each other to serve that function, but still got to sort of be immersed in it and participate in it to some degree. And then I got to go up to Vancouver when they shot the pilot, again as the assistant to the producers. But that was pretty great because I hadn't been home in a while. And we were there for, I think, 2 or 3 months between, all the prep and then the actual shooting of the pilot. And I'd been on set for the Veronica Mars movies a couple times to deliver things to people or whatever, but I hadn't really been on set that much. So, and Rob directed the pilot, so I kind of got to hang out in Video Village and watch everything from behind the scenes, which was pretty cool, first of all, and then pretty educational at the same time. And then from there, we went back to LA. We didn't know if the show was going to get picked up yet, but I stayed on as their assistant for the post-production process, during which they were staffing, future writers in case the show got picked up. So that was a bit of a weird situation because I wanted to be one of those writers, and here I am, printing off scripts to hand to our producers to read for them to hire other people. And Rob did give me the opportunity, and Diane gave me the opportunity to submit a piece of material and see if I was ready yet to become a staff member. I was not. I did submit something. It just wasn't quite at the level that the other writers were, which was totally fair. And so I became the writer's assistant on season 1. But there's also a thing within the Writers Guild where every show is meant to have an episode per season written by somebody who's not on staff, like a freelance episode. And so I was given that freelance episode, which is what happens on a lot of shows. An assistant will get their first opportunity in that way. And Rob and Diane were generous again enough to give me that opportunity. And so I wrote my first episode as I was, the writer's assistant. And this was after we had done Play It Again, Dick. So I'd worked with Rob in that capacity to some extent already. And then I got to go back to Vancouver for the production of that episode. My visa also ran out right around that time, so I had to stay in Vancouver for a while. But again, thanks to the generosity of my bosses, I got to work on the production side of iZombie for the remainder of the first season. And then at the beginning of the second season, I was offered a full-time writing job and was able to secure a visa to come back. So that was kind of the sort of incremental and roundabout path that got me to writing full-time for the show. But getting up to Vancouver is always fun. We get to go every time we're credited with an episode, and you hang out for usually a few days, a couple days of pre-production, a couple days of production, and it's always great. It's always a combination of it's cool to hang out with the actors, and they're always at least kind enough to pretend they like you and they're happy to see you. So that's great. You feel pretty special. You get to see the stuff that you've written or at least contributed to writing, being made manifest in front of your eyes, which is pretty cool. And then you also, being on set tells you things that you can't know when you're staring at a page in terms of what works and what doesn't and why it doesn't work, and just getting familiar with how what you're writing translates into an actual product is going to inform the next time you sit down to write something. And so that's always helpful in the long run, I think, too.
What was the episode?
Well, my first episode was called Maternity Live. That was in the first season. Yeah. And that was the one where it was like a young expectant mother who had passed. And so Liv became very maternal, which was not my forte, not having been a mother myself. So as I recall, all of the mother stuff that worked in that episode was written by Diane, because our co-creators, Rob and Diane will rewrite stuff to get it more in their voice for everyone's script, and it's always a bit of I guess a goal to have as little rewritten as possible. But you know that there's a certain amount that's going to get rewritten no matter what, and that just comes with the territory of writing on any show. But that one, Diane handled all the mother stuff. And then this past year, we finally got to do one, slight spoiler, I guess, but we finally got to do one that Diane and I have been pitching for a long time, or hoping for a long time, which is live on the brain of a hockey goon. So that was a lot of fun, and I got to be on the ice for that for a little bit too, which was a fun little bit of nostalgic throwback for me.
Did you get to choose the way she consumed the food in that original season, or were they doing it?
I don't think we did that the first season. We had her making meals, certainly, but I think it was more in the second season or late first season that we decided to kind of tie them to the brains and do that stylistic, kind of quick cut montage of her making the food. I feel like we only started that really in season 2, and it kind of doesn't. The logic is a bit iffy because she's not on the brain yet, so she shouldn't necessarily be thinking in terms of the personality that she's about to take on, but it's just a thing that we like, that we have fun with and that we enjoy seeing. This time around, I did get to choose that because the hockey goon in question was Canadian, as am I, so that it felt like I had a little more autonomy when it came to certain things. And I shouldn't say I got to choose it. I pitched an idea that landed for this one. So
very cool.
Yeah.
Is there a character's voice on the show that you personally like or feel connected to? I mean, there's some fun characters on the show.
Yeah, they're all so much fun. I have a really hard time writing my episodes. When we get sent off to to execute an episode, we've been given the beats pretty specifically, like all laid out in order. Sometimes we've talked about the scene so in depth that we know exactly what the transition is to get in the scene, to get out of the scene. We even know some specific joke lines that are going to be in there. So you have a lot of information going in, but I still have a really hard time filling in those gaps. I stare at the page for hours, sometimes just sort of beating myself up over not being able to figure out, the way in or around this particular beat. But the one character that I feel comes to me a little bit easier than the others is probably Blaine. Blaine and Donnie are the two that I find, I guess I can just sort of hear them in my head the best, which I don't know what that says about me, that I can relate mostly to the criminals on the show, the mass murderers, but for whatever reason, David Anders' voice just gets in my head automatically in a way that I struggle with the other characters. And with Rose, who does such an amazing job embodying a different character every week, there is a voice of Liv, I think, that she conveys in the moments, in the early episode or late episode when she's sort of off the brain. But episode to episode, you're not really writing for Liv, you're writing for whoever the murdered victim was. So that can be tricky episode to episode. It's a little easier when the brain that is chosen for you or that you land on for your episode is a little more in your wheelhouse, as it was for me this time, more so than the mother episode. But it's always hard because there's purposely built into the show, not meant to be consistency from one episode to the other. But all the actors, I think, have done a really good job of giving us so much to work with, of doing more with our early scripts than we necessarily expected, and showing us what the voice of that character should be. So that helps a lot when you're writing any of them, because they've done such a specific job in finding that voice that you can hear it. You can go back and watch old episodes and feel like, okay, I do understand a little bit about what the flavor of the scene should be for Robbie or for Clive or for Mage or Peyton. But again, for whatever reason, the one that feels most inherently in me already is Blaine.
Blaine's terrific, yeah.
Yeah.
I've got to ask a kind of interesting dynamic about TV shows right now, in that it's a CW show, but I think a lot of people consume this show on Netflix and on other avenues. Does that play into, are you all, obviously all aware of that, but what are your feelings on something like that, where I know I've gotten a lot more people into the show who've never seen the CW side of it, and I'm like, catch up on Netflix.
Right. That's
got to be something special to have, where there's like a backlog for you guys already on a show that's still doing very well and thriving.
Yeah, that's how I consume a lot of my TV as well, is through streaming services or viewing after the fact in one way or another. So I think it's great that people can find us that way as well, if they don't necessarily have regular Tuesday night TV viewing habits. It's a little confusing sometimes, or just nebulous, I guess, for somebody in my position, because I'm not privy to information on ratings beyond what everyone gets on the internet. So I will look and see what our ratings are, because I like my job and I hope I get to keep it. So I'm very curious as to how we're doing. But it's really hard to gauge how we're doing when so many of our viewers watch it and consume it in a different way than broadcast or DVR, PVR. So it's great that I can tell friends at home that that's where they can watch it when most of my friends are watching stuff on Netflix and Hulu and that sort of thing. But it can also be a little sort of, it can leave you up in the air in terms of like, are we going to be renewed year after year? Because you don't really know how well you're doing by the traditional metrics anymore. So,
with that in mind, obviously Rob has a very special connection to his fans about the concept of a show being canceled or on the verge of it, and that being something that the fans have made an impact. What does that mean to you to be a part? I think you're part of Rob's team, you're part of this world, and I think the fans have, maybe not all of them from Veronica Mars have come over, but I do think the sensibilities of the two shows are very similar, and the fan base has shifted. That's got to be special to have that type of diehard fan.
Yeah, I mean, it's Rob does have that kind of following, and I think it's great. And I think we've used a lot of actors from Veronica Mars on our show. I mean, there's a huge arc in season 4 with Jason Doring, who's great. Still trying to see if we can get Kristen Bell at some point, but we did have her do a audiobook. She read an audiobook in one of our second season episodes, I think it was. But it's great. It's great to have that crossover or that sort of. I don't know exactly what you call it, brand synergy or something, probably. But yeah, to have that type of community that is that voracious in their fandom for Rob's work is pretty great to kind of ride the coattails of. And I got to, when Rob was living in Austin and they launched that Kickstarter, he threw a big party at a bar whose name I've forgotten, but it was for like all the Kickstarter backers that wanted to show up, and it was on, I think it was on the last day and the last evening of bidding, and it was great just to get to talk to people that were like, so amazed that myself and my friends from school were working with Rob and had just kind of met him and were now part of that world, and to see how much Veronica Mars had meant to them, that they were willing, like a lot of these people came from out of town, and we knew that like 90,000 people had backed this movie or whatever, but to meet some of those people in person who had flown in from all over the country and were just such, like, that show had meant so much to them that they were willing to do that and to spend their own money on trying to resurrect it in whatever way. It was cool to be a part of, and also, you often are just sort of writing in a vacuum. Even when we're doing iZombie, like, clearly we understand that the show is on the air and we have an engagement with our followers on Twitter and that sort of thing, but you don't really get to talk to people that that I don't want to say live and die by the show, but for whom the show means quite a bit. You don't get to talk to them on a daily basis, face to face, and so being exposed to that was. It didn't necessarily give me a window into my future, but it certainly showed you what impact writing for television can have, which makes you feel a little bit cooler about doing that for a living, because sometimes it just feels sort of, you can feel a little bit like a prostitute, you're churning something out for a giant corporation that, is consumed and then forgotten is how you feel sometimes. But to know that the stuff sticks with people, makes you feel a little bit cooler about what you do, I think.
Speaking of a window of the future, I'd love to ask you what, I mean, obviously you can't give us too much on what's about to happen, but for you personally, are you writing outside the show? Are you looking for other ideas? What are you doing kind of on the side? And then, yeah, if there's anything you can give us on the show, that'd be wonderful.
I can try. Well, I'll answer your first question first. We're always, like all the people that are sort of lower level writers on our show, and I think any other show, are always trying to work on their own material, either for development purposes or just to have that piece of material that's going to get you your next job. Because you never know when the show you're on is going to end. Our show goes 13 episodes, most seasons, including this one. So we're off for a good chunk of the year on hiatus, waiting to find out if iZombie is going to come back. So you have to be ready in case it doesn't. And so you're always working on your own stuff for those reasons. The stuff I'm working on is it's always slow going, but it's in the realm of, tonally in the same realm of iZombie, maybe a little more geared toward cable, and maybe more on the side of like half-hour dramedy than hour-long dramedy. I feel like the lines are being sort of blurred, but if I'm on one side of that fence, it's probably more toward the Silicon Valley or Veep side of things. So that's what I try to write. I'm, nothing. There's nobody banging down my door to see those scripts at this point. But like I said, you try to have that piece material ready in case iZombie doesn't come back. And in our world, that is your resume or your calling card for getting your next job. Now, as far as iZombie goes, we have left off at the end of season 3 with a pretty big game changer, with the the reveal that to the world that zombies exist, and the creation of thousands of new zombies. So I don't want to give too much away, but season 4 starts a few months down the road in this new reality, and it's opened up a whole bunch of different opportunities and options for storylines for us now that this zombieism is no longer a secret. So there's lots of stuff with Fillmore Graves is still running Seattle. Chase Graves is still at the head of that organization. So there's lots of stuff with them. Major, at the end of last season, became a zombie again. Mm-hmm. And so he's all in with Fillmore Graves, which causes some tension with with Robbie and Liv. And Liv and Clive are still solving cases. There are still murders in Seattle, and the Seattle Police Department is still performing their function, although it's a little bit ambiguous, I guess, as to who's actually running the city, if it's the infrastructure that was in place prior to this, or if it's Fillmore Graves that sort of created this new world order. So there's lots of, I don't want to get too specific and get myself in trouble, but there's lots of stuff to explore in that way. And I think we've got a run of our best and funniest brains of the series so far, like pretty much from episode 1 to episode 13, which we haven't actually broken yet. So I'd be lying if I said episode 13 is a great brain, since we don't know what it is. But all the way through the season, it is just like funny brain after funny brain.
Well, I can't wait to check out your episode or episodes. And Bob, I really appreciate you coming here and talking with us. I'm a fan, and so thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Awesome.